Today's episode is with Quiana Agbai, aka Harlem Lovebirds, and I am so excited for you to get to know her. So Quiana and I met at The Wing. And if you don't know what The Wing is, it is an incredible women's co-working space that opened in Boston this summer and has been all around the United States. And just, I believe, this week opened their first international location in London. So at The Wing, they have these incredible events, and one of the early events was with Valerie Jarrett, the senior advisor to President Barack Obama. And if you read Michelle Obama's book, Becoming, Valerie Jarrett was a very pivotal person in her life and her journey, and the rest of the Obama family. When the speaking portion was over and it was time for Q&A, Quiana stood up and introduced herself as the Boston Outreach Lead for Moms Demand Action. And her question blew me away. Her question was around gun violence and the treatment of gun violence on a national and local level, but also the segregation that seems to happen in the coverage, the legislative support, and the public outcry around these gun violence deaths and this need for gun sense across the country. Immediately, I was like, ooh, I need to know this person. And I walked over to her and I said, hi, you want to be on my podcast? And here we are today. Quiana and I have connected since then, and I'm so excited to call her a friend. She has so many incredible insights that you will hear in this episode. We talk about Mom's Demand, but we also talk about the fact that Quiana, aka Harlem Lovebirds, like I said earlier, has been blogging since 2009. We talked about the transformation of the digital landscape, and as we recorded this episode, one of her tweets had gone viral. And we talked a little bit about what that's all about, what that's like. We also talk about this whole idea of kind of transforming into this expert and understanding what expertise is all about and embracing the fact that we are experts in this world. A lot of times, specifically women, aren't encouraged to stand in the role of an expert, just in the same way as a lot of times women aren't encouraged to stand in the role of a leader. In previous episodes, I've talked about how there are these lists of the 100 best leaders, and so often, so many incredibly qualified women are not considered in the running. So Quiana and I talk about burnout and the importance of understanding and appreciating the role that mental health plays in how we operate in our day-to-day lives, especially when you're on a non-traditional career path, when you're trying to juggle this life of an entrepreneur, this life of a blogger, this life of being a mother, of being an activist, and trying to find time for all of those things. There are so many incredible things that we cover in this episode, and I don't want to give them all away, but I will tell you that after this, I hope that you follow Quiana on Instagram because she has so many incredible things that she shares in her stories and her posts that will make you think, that will make you feel heard and seen, but also will encourage you to start more conversation with those around you. So without further ado, here's my friend Quiana. Hi, Quiana.
Hello.
Thank you for joining me today. I am so excited to have you on Checkbox Other.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to just fangirl, maybe. I don't know, geek out a little bit is probably the way to say it. For those of you that don't know, and I'm sure I'm going to gush about this in the intro too, but Quiana, it feels like the universe just put her in this incredible room of conversation that I was in at The Wing with the amazing Valerie Jarrett came to speak about her life and her experiences in her new book. And Quiana stood up and asked what I thought was just the question that no one was asking or talking about in many of the spaces I was in. And she just nailed it. All the themes around gun violence, but also the conversation on a larger discourse around the gun reform, the use of guns, the mentality around guns in our country and in our society, and then add the wonderful classism and racism and all the isms that go on top of how this highly fraught topic has come to a point where we're talking about it each and every day. And so before we hop into all the questions that I had prepared, I want to, Quiana, give you an opportunity to give a little bit of background on yourself, and then also, right before we hopped on the recording, Quiana sent me this amazing tweet that she shared with the world. She was on an interview this week, and it is just blowing up. So I'd love to hear about you, but then also about how all this amazing stuff is happening and how this excitement is coming to the forefront here.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, I'm Quiana Agbai. I came out to Boston to attend Wellesley College back in 1998 and left and then returned. And since being here in 2016, I really tried to find a way to re-engage in Boston. My family were first-time homeowners here in Boston. There's a lot of nuance. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio. My husband's from Brooklyn. I think being an urban family, being an African American family, having in-laws who are immigrants, I think there's so many worlds that I cross from that Midwest upbringing that I have living in New York City for a time. I even spent a couple years in Portsmouth, New Hampshire during the last election before coming back to Boston in 2016. So I just hit the 3-year mark of being back here. And so when I was trying to find a place of where I fit in, my professional background after Wellesley, where I studied psychology and economics, my professional background was in the world of advertising and marketing. So I worked at an agency, I worked client side in their marketing department, and then went back agency side when I moved to New York City. And then when I had my first child in 2010, and then my second child in 2014, it really kind of refocused my role in the world as a mother. So when I got back to Boston in 2016, I was trying to think of, here I am back in Boston. Didn't think I'd end up back in Boston after leaving. Originally, I didn't envision a life here raising a family, but this is where we're at. My husband's job brought us here. And so we met 20 years ago in college. We were 18. And so 20 years ago, last month, we met. So to be back in Boston, I was thinking, where can I fit in? What's a great way to start to relearn the city? And I was also coming up against what had just happened with the last election and wanting to make an impact. And having been raised through single-sex institutions from my time in Columbus, Ohio, I went to Columbus School for Girls, 8th through 12th grade, and then Wellesley, graduating in 2002, there was this legacy of being pro-girl, pro-woman. Where does that play? And so I had started a blog in 2009 called Harlem Lovebirds. We were newlyweds in Harlem, just sharing what it was like to be an urban family. But through that blog and having now had it for 10 years, it's really opened up the door to be more outward facing. So while I don't traditionally blog as much as I used to, I do more showing up offline. So that's how I ended up at the Wing. Yes. And so I do a lot of outward facing things. And when I came back in 2016 to Boston, that following year, after feeling like my children were starting to get settled into school, I have a 5 and a 9-year-old now, 5-year-old son, 9-year-old daughter, I saw that Moms Demand Action was starting up a new chapter. And I didn't want to have to wait for a gun incident to happen to my family. There's so many of us who are survivors, the survivor meaning that someone in our life has been impacted by gun violence. Maybe you've even been personally threatened by gun violence. I didn't want to wait for that moment. I couldn't continue to watch the news and just say, oh, thoughts and prayers. I wanted to do something proactive to feel like I was a part of the movement to bring gun sense legislation to the forefront. And knowing that Massachusetts has been a leader in so many key issues, including universal health care. I know a lot of people like to call it Obamacare, but it really began with Mitt Romney here in Massachusetts. And the way that Massachusetts has led the way on gay marriage, on other gun sense laws, I said, I want to be a part of that. Massachusetts is a leader in that regard. So I linked up with Moms Demand Action the fall of 2017 as the Boston Community Outreach Lead. That means I'm outward facing to other anti-gun violence organizations. Boston has a rich legacy of these organizations. There's a lot of segregation that happens in the community, and I think I mentioned that at the Wing. At that time, we were just coming off the July shootings that had impacted Dorchester, Mattapan. There was just a string of all these shootings in Boston that made national news, but we're surrounded by these other high-income communities, neighborhoods, where a lot of the focus might be more on, what's happening with active shooters in schools, school shootings, mass shootings. But when it comes to the gun violence in Black and Brown communities who are the most impacted by gun violence, sometimes you hear crickets. So when I looked around the room at the Wing, it made me question, how is it that we can all come together in a lot of times these homogenous white spaces and show up, but for other things we don't show up. So what can we do about that? And so that's the question I posed to Valerie Jarrett. So what's happening right now on Twitter is this week I was on a Boston 25 interview, our local Fox affiliate, regarding active shooter drills and my role in not only being the Boston Community Outreach Lead, but as a parent of children in Boston, or of two children in Boston Public Schools. What is the psychological impact on my kids? What's the language that's being shared with active shooter drills? So I tweeted out about this, about these active shooter drills, with a screenshot of my interview when I was on the news earlier this week. And I really wanted to let people know that they need to be proactive in asking their schools, what's going on in that regard. So Shannon Watts, who is the founder of Moms Demand Action, she's tweeted it out now. She's tweeted out my soundbite. She retweeted my own tweet, and I can just see all of the people who are engaging, who are sharing, who are now having a dialogue. And so that's the screenshot I shared with you, Nikki. So I think it might even be up to 11,000 impressions. Ooh. Yeah, it's up to 10,800. So it just keeps going.
Yeah.
And so that's what's happening right now, real time. And that's what we need, more conversations. And that's the beauty of social media in a nutshell.
Yeah. And, one of the questions that I had up front was around just the progression of the online space and the social media space, as you've been blogging for 10 years. And 10 years ago, blogging wasn't something that is as prevalent or as in your hand, right? Not everyone had a smartphone in their hand. Not everyone was interacting with digital content on, I was going to say a daily basis, maybe a minute by minute basis, right? And so just even thinking about how the digital space has shifted to have something like a screenshot of an interview become something that is now not in front of just the audience that has known you for the last 10 years or however long, but then gets amplified to tens of thousands of people that may not have known who you are, but your message is resonating so, so deeply. So I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of just the perspective of the last decade of how this progress has happened for you.
Oh, yeah. I had really thought about blogging as a journal, an online journal. Since I was 7, I've kept a written journal. I have them somewhere on the shelf over there. My daughter, who's 9, she's a 4th grader. She gets a kick out of reading my own old journals. But I really wanted to have a way to track my progression of my family from newlywed to new parents to living in Harlem. Growing up in Ohio, there was kind of a fascination of, what is that like, going from the Midwest to living someplace so different like Harlem, and being able to show that online, take pictures and go to events and all of that. And then I started to see there's sponsored content options coming out. Do you want to partner? Do you want to be a brand ambassador? And all this language that I was familiar with from my time working in marketing, we were creating traditional media plans with print, radio, all of that. We weren't in the digital space so much. At the time, we were starting to talk about bloggers. Sometimes we were working with them, but the digital agency was just starting to blossom. And it was kind of like, oh, that's them over there. Like, I didn't really connect. Like, I'm like, who's online? Like, I want to read a magazine. Like,
I want it in my hands. Yep.
Exactly. So I think it was cool to be in that traditional space and kind of evolve into the digital space, and then to be able to see these opportunities for bringing in income that were happening. And then the thought of, what are ways, now that I've been doing this for a while, how does it evolve? It felt very tone deaf by the time I got to like 2014 and was moving to New Hampshire and having a front seat to the political stage there during the last election. It just felt tone deaf to come up and say, you know what, let me tell you about this wonderful sippy cup for my baby. And I'm like, yes, there's a place for that. And I think you can make your media mix whatever. But to me, and for what I was called to do, and kind of the way that I've felt my purpose, even coming back from my time going to Columbus School for Girls, going to Wellesley, I felt that there was more than just continuing business as usual as a quote unquote mommy blogger. And so now we like to say, oh, I'm an influencer. And I've even kind of separated myself from that language. I think of myself as a connector more so, a communicator. and also a consultant. So there's an aspect of what I do that pulls in my professional experience in marketing and media planning and all of that account management that I was doing, where I'm now finding there's a lot of small business owners who want the expertise of someone in the marketing background. But I also have two sisters, one's a publicist, one's a graphic designer. And we kind of said, you know, is there a way to combine our efforts? And so 5 years ago, we started Trifecta Media Group to be able to do that. Because while my children, ages 5 and 9, are my primary concern, I still wanted to keep a foot in the door, and I didn't want my degree to go to waste. And so it was very important to keep some type of momentum in my professional career. And so having Trifecta Media Group as a formalized company 5 years ago was really important to me. I want to do more with it. I think there's a lot of opportunities to champion other small businesses and for them to be able to come under one umbrella and get their marketing, PR, and graphic design all together instead of having, you know, to piecemeal it. So I think there's something there 5 years in the making that I want to expand upon. But right now, for what's happening, the work that I'm doing with Moms Demand Action, the work that I'm doing at Wellesley still, I'm the vice president of the local Alumni Club of Boston. I'm also part of the Leadership Connect Collective for the Wellesley Racial Justice Initiative, which is an ad hoc student organization to champion anti-racism efforts. And then I'm also part of things in my community. I don't share the neighborhood that I live in, but let's just say it's part of the Keep Massachusetts Beautiful umbrella. So for my community, I write the version of Humans of New York. I do that for my community once a month. I'm not always the original author, but I kind of organize it, keep it moving forward. And that's something that I've been doing, for about a year now. So there's lots of ways to show up. And I think being able to have the space online was the starting point in 2009. And it's been really great to kind of progress and see where it takes me. Similar to the tweet I mentioned, I get found a lot online, and then it leads to offline opportunities. So I'm doing a lot more speaking engagements, a lot more paid speaking engagements. And I think finding other profit centers that I can tap into what my passion is, and also amplify and build on the work that other women especially are doing. So that's kind of the space I'm in. It's really exciting. There's a lot of opportunities out there. And I think one of the questions I always get is, how do you do it all? Like, you make me tired. You make me tired just watching everything you're doing. And I think what guides me is the fact that I'm not going to get a do-over. Like, this is it. Like, I'm not going to be able to go back and be like, okay, well, now this is the dress rehearsal. Now I'm going to, so I think that guides me. And so I've been really protective of my time. I think as I become more civically engaged, it's caused me to vet opportunities a lot better, to be able to say, okay, well, what's the time limit on this? What are you asking me for? What is the term? I think when I was activated in 2014 in New Hampshire, it was like, sign me up for everything.
Right.
And,
yes.
And now, 5 years later, I'm like, okay, and there's a health aspect to it, a mental health aspect, especially to it. And, I don't want to burn myself out. And so I just turned 39 and approaching my 40th birthday. Next year, I'm thinking about, let's work smarter. Right. And that's kind of the life stage I'm in right now.
Yeah, that's amazing. I feel like there were so many things that you mentioned that rang true in a bunch of different ways, whether they were synonymous or just the theme felt very, very familiar. I think one of the questions that I have, and one of the feelings in life where you feel other or that you don't belong when you're doing a non-traditional career, or you've chosen a path where people are seeing what you're doing, but they can't quite wrap their head around how it's a job or a business, you get that question of like, so wait, you're doing all these things, but what do you do again? And then it starts to become this experience of like, I want to see under the hood of something that I wouldn't necessarily ask somebody else in a different career to see under the hood of their stuff. And so I don't know, I'd love to hear, it's something that I find myself wrestling with a lot. So maybe that's why it piqued my interest so much. But as you're diving into these very purposeful avenues for using your energy for change and for impact and improvement, how have you handled kind of setting both those boundaries within yourself and setting those boundaries externally to ensure that the time and the energy you're putting towards things is, one, allowing you to feel like I belong doing what I'm doing, and also giving a clear kind of communication out to the world around you that's really interested in what you're doing, but might not know exactly how to interact with or appreciate and value the time you're putting towards things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It actually prompted me, I don't know, maybe over a year ago or more, to write a post that I kept sticky on my blog called, like, what does Quiana do? Because I kept getting that question so much. And I was like, well, let me just put it there. And I got tired of regurgitating it, that it became just like, this is what I'm doing, if you're wondering. Like, as I would get like questions of, can you do this? Can I add this on your pile? I would just say, hey, I'm kind of committed right now. If you're curious about where I'm involved, take a look at this. And it would just crystallize like, oh, okay, so you're doing Moms Demand Action. You're doing, at the time, I think I was in the leadership team of my local Toastmasters chapter, the parent piece, all of these things. And I kind of spelled it out. And then it became like, oh, okay. So sometimes I find that I harbor like a little bit of impatience for people who are like, don't you see what I'm doing? Like, and then I was like, you know what? Let me just spell it out so people understand, and be very gracious to say thank you for thinking of me. But I'm overcommitted, or I'm at max capacity. I've reached my bandwidth. So even with my own children, I've had to explain. I said recently, you know how your iPad gets really full and you can't add any more apps on it? I was like, that's mommy's mind most of the time. And then it was like, I could see in their heads, they were like, oh, mommy's mind is full. And I was like, yeah.
We got to delete some of those photos right now.
Right. So if I forget things, you know, the kids are not always very sympathetic. It's like, oh, you forgot. It was pajama day on Friday. You're the worst mommy. And I'm like, but you're living every day. You're living every day well. Like, it's okay that you forgot, that I forgot pajama day. Like, goodness, they're the harshest little employers, these kids. But I think a lot of times, sometimes I just tell people, this is what I'm doing. Even on my Instagram stories, I posted a sponsored post yesterday.
I saw that.
And I had to think about, you know, I don't have a lot of sponsored content. I get the option to have a lot of sponsored content that I decline. I become more selective over the years. The post I shared most recently, it was a brand that I've been a customer of since we got married, like 2009, 10-year customer. Now I'm being brought on to do sponsored content. Yes, I'm going to do it. I look for things that are organic. I think we have to stop snubbing our noses. Is that the word? Or thumbing our noses, whatever the term is, at people who have multiple profit centers, who might have a pie and might say, oh, why aren't you blogging just about causes for free? It's like this notion of you have to understand people now have different ways of bringing in income. If I can get a speaking fee here, if I can get a sponsored post here, if I can do some consulting work under my umbrella of Trifecta Media Group, these are all pieces that come together that enable me to live the type of life that I want to live. Right. And I think the conversations that are really important to your point of looking under the hood, especially as women, that we need to be more transparent about how we're crafting this, because it's not It's not what's being taught in like a liberal arts education, for example. And a lot of us are getting to the point, I feel like, in this third life crisis, once you hit your 30s, where it's kind of like, but I want to be a good partner. I want to be a good parent. Maybe you have older parents who might be having health issues, but your employer has requests of you, but you're realizing that you might want a side hustle. How do you put all those things together? And I think the ability to have more candid conversations about how you make it work is something that a lot of women are craving right now. And if I could fill the gap in sharing that, like on my Instagram stories, when I put that sponsored post up in my feed, I then went on my stories and said, let me tell you a little bit about sponsored content. This is how my pie works for me. And it allows me to be able to head out in an hour and go pick up my kids from school.
Right.
Like that's what's important to me. I need to be there for my kids. Everyone's priorities are different. And I think we're finding out now that we have the power to create the life that we want. And for me, it's taken 10 years to figure out. But if I can do something like this and share it on the podcast, if I can get up at a conference, I've spoken at like Altitude Summit, at Mom 2.0, at BlogHer, at Blogalicious when it existed. I've spoken at General Assembly locally. I spoke at All Together Now recently, a conference that for women entrepreneurs. So I think there's all these opportunities to engage and share, and I'm always seeking those out because I think it's very powerful when you live open-handedly and you share, because there's enough for everybody.
Yes.
And that was something I heard from Harriet Cole at Blogalicious. I think it was even my first Blogalicious, maybe in 2012 out in Vegas. And she had that image of open-handed living. And I said, ooh, that's how I want to live my life. Not that I'm giving everything away, but if I have something to share, I share it. And 9 times out of 10, when I do that, things come back to me in return.
Yeah.
So it's worked for me. And
I think the one thing that I'm hearing, I mean, both in the women's leadership work and certification and coaching and stuff that I do, but also in this space of creating space for unheard stories and voices to have a platform to be amplified one way or another, it is important to acknowledge that there are all those pieces of the pie are better because they are part of the pie with one another, not singularly saying, okay, I'm going to be my work person here, and I'm going to be my mother person here, and I'm going to be the daughter here, and I'm going to be the activist here. It's, yeah, those are all parts of my pie, but this pie tastes so much better and is so much more satisfying and is so much more sustainable when I'm able to live fully in all of those spaces and have them cross one another in the ways that feel appropriate, and really acknowledge that in order to be as much of myself as I can be, I have to allow myself to dabble in each of these things in a way that I can understand where my energy goes and how my energy is used. I think that that's really, really, really important. I'd love to hear just a little bit from you about how, as you're having a lot of people, I'm sure, come to you around your thought leadership work. And I think thought leadership, so when I was in corporate, I worked in advertising and in marketing as well, and then kind of more in financial services, but thought leadership were like white papers and were all these big, huge reports and super kind of stuffy and templated. And I'm people can't see me. I'm like super like robotic right now. And what I've witnessed as in following you and in being in spaces where you're sharing these incredible insights of other women as well, is that you do such a wonderful job, I think, of making it just conversational and making this thought leadership. It could be the 140 characters or 280 now of a tweet, but ensuring that we don't have to be polished in such a way that we become distant. We can still be human in the way we communicate. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, I heard that a bit in your decisions, like, okay, I do sponsored or affiliate work with organizations and brands that I'm using in my everyday life. So I'm not putting on a different mask to talk about that. But I'd love to hear a little bit about how you've approached just really showing up as human as possible, as kind of me in my journal, normal human being as possible in what you're putting out in the world.
And in that regard, I think it's very important that I've let myself remain accessible. I mean, I am, I guess, what you'd call a micro influencer. So I have under 10,000 followers, but I show up in big ways in person. So I'm always offering that opportunity. You're curious about what I do? Let's sit down. Let's have that conversation. I don't like the term pick your brain. I get that request a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of let's have a conversation. And I use the script of what are you working on that I might be able to have the skill set or resources to amplify or support. When I approach people in that regard, it does become very conversational versus transactional. It's more so, let me hear about you, and then I might have some things that fill in the gap. And that was something I learned very much so from the book Never Eat Alone, Keith Ferrazzi. And he's, I think that's how you say his last name. He's since updated it, but my best friend recommended that book to me many years ago before I moved to New York City from Boston back in 2007. And it really changed the way I interact with people. And I think rather than showing up at networking events or blogging conferences and just passing out my business card, it's been more so let's talk about your challenges, your pain points, what's going on with you, and then maybe we can see if there's a chance for us to work together, or maybe if not now, down the line, at least we've had this conversation, and then I can remember you. And so even when I show up on social media, I respond to my DMs. If I see something that's interesting, I share it with someone. I'm always sharing opportunities with people. If they say, "Hey, I'm looking for a grant for XYZ." Oh, now you verbalized it. Well, then once you verbalize it, you get added to the Quiana roster, and anything I see, I'm going to send to you. So I always give almost like a disclaimer is like, once you say you're doing something or you're looking for something, be prepared because I'm going to send things your way. And it happens all the time that I've shown up for people in that regard, just to even ping people and say, "Hey, I'm thinking of you, saw this opportunity, thought of you." It's amazing the ROI that I get just from being that thoughtful person. And like you were saying, that kind of like robotic, whatever, getting away from that and making it very conversational, checking in with people. It takes a lot of work. It's a lot of emotional work to maintain relationships, but I think it's worth it. And I've seen that come back and be beneficial time and time again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a part, it just came up in my mind is those Angie's List commercials, I think they are, where they ask, right? And then they're like, "Okay, cool. Can you do this, this, and this?" And I think that, in my experience, I tend to be very similar in the sense that like the transactional networking is just really, really difficult for me to wrap my mind around now that I'm not in the standard path of quote unquote traditional success. When I went to a business school, and from the first moment you're there at like 17 years old, you're told you're going to have 3 internships. Every interaction you're having is networking. You know how to look up and down a name tag at a networking event appropriately to understand who people are, where they fall, thinking about the opportunities you have. So it becomes a very transactional dynamic. And I'm not going to lie, the fact that they promoted that you get a 96% job placement rating, I mean, there is fruit to that labor, but it doesn't get inside, right? It doesn't hit your soul. It doesn't hit the fact that there's still so much energy that actually goes out in doing that, but it separates itself from the humanity of who you are and making true connections with human beings. So I think that it's just beautiful that you said that so wonderfully, but also to acknowledge that still takes as much, if not, I mean, personally for me, I know it takes more energy to really show up as much as that you like to show up when you're present with people, and still kind of handle the fact that networking for a lot of people still feels pretty transactional. And so understanding where you can take things to a certain point where it's like, okay, this isn't necessarily fruitful, or I'm going to model the way that I hope we can have this relationship moving forward.
And I think that goes back to some mental health aspects, because that's something that I've learned this year, coming up this or going back to the spring, starting up in therapy and talking about boundaries and how do I manage all of this, and then being willing to kind of put those boundaries in place and have them respected. And it's caused me to kind of go back and edit some of my commitments. And
Mm,
it's just such a good feeling to be like, okay, am I going to be okay if I say no to this, or like
mm,
letting go of those things, or reducing my responsibility in some way, and looking back and saying, oh my gosh, it's been a year since I moved on from that thing. And not that it wasn't positive, but that the time has ended and it's time. Sometimes you just move on to something else. And I think what you were saying about modeling, sometimes there's a way that you can do that that allows other people to see the possibility for freedom and opportunity and inspiration to do the same in their own lives. So I'm really cognizant of that.
yeah, one of the things, so I see a therapist. We talked a little bit about therapy before we hopped on and how important it is, but I also see a coach that's the reason I went to her about a year ago was specifically around boundaries, and my boundaries have have evolved wonderfully. But one of the things that I loved that she told me, and I think specifically this is important for women, is this idea that being an alpha, like if you think about training a dog, we'll say that it's really important. You could be wonderful and kind to this dog and hugging the dog and doing all these things, but if you don't show the dog how to eat food and go to the bathroom and be on a leash and do all these things, the dog will feel like it doesn't necessarily know how it's supposed to exist in the world, and it will keep doing things wrong and be scolded or disciplined but not sure really why. And I think specifically for women, and in doing a lot of women's leadership work, but also now, being a woman in a lot of male dominated spaces, I felt as though I just needed to be open and free and flexible for whatever came my way. And I could handle it. But there wasn't any kind of, definitely in my corporate career, there weren't hours of operation. There weren't even just from a job description perspective, the jobs, they would all slip and slide in a way that I was like, sure, I'll do 5 job descriptions worth of work right now because I can, and I can do it well and I can do it great, but I'm also not sleeping. I'm also burning out and doing all those things. And so I do think not only are boundaries a wonderful thing to model in that kind of sense, but I think that it also helps other people learn how to interact with you. So hopefully they get an inspiration themselves to start
Mm-hmm.
setting those boundaries. But it has it so I find, especially right now, I have some friends, especially older friends, in that time of me just being like, yeah, sure, we're open for business all the time, come on in, doing this little like dipping a toe in and being like, should I do this? I don't
Mm-hmm.
really know, because at that point in time I had no boundaries, and now I do, but our relationship was from years ago. And so it's really understanding how to say, no, you know what, sorry, I don't do this anymore. Or if I do, we need to have a clear intention of why we're here. What do you need from
Mm-hmm.
me? What are we doing? This isn't an endless amount of
Yeah.
Nikki's time. So
Right.
I think that that's an important piece to this too. And I feel like, I'd love to hear a little bit how activism specifically, we started there, but I feel like activism is such a fertile ground for a lot of emotion and time and investment and energy and people. I mean, there's endless time for conversation, right? And especially now we do a
Right.
lot of conversation. Um, how have you found the work in activism specifically with Moms Demand, and I also and with Wellesley? Um, how has that played out? How has um, the boundaries that you put in place, and then also interacting with others? I'm assuming when you're in this space, a lot of other people are kind of navigating this same space as well.
I I tend to notice in the places that I show up that the people who are so passionate about any cause tend to be passionate about a lot of causes. And so a lot of times you see like the same few people show up for lots of things versus lots of people showing up for lots of things. And so there's this notion of like, oh, that's the activist person. Here's one more cause that you should be doing. And it's like, no, you can do it too. Like it's not like that's all I do. And so I try to be very it's really hard. It's to have a lot of grace and empathy to know that the way that I feel activated, it took me time to get there. Not everybody's going to feel as passionate, and let's meet people where they're at. Let's not guilt people, but let's challenge them to do better. And I really love the work that Lovey Ajayi has done with her platform and challenging people to do better. And in fact, I'm thinking, I even have her book down here. I'm Judging
Yes.
You.
I
So
love
she's
that
at
book.
the wall. Like, it's there. And it's, I think her book really spurred me to think about how do we talk to people and engage people in a way that doesn't put them off from getting involved or overwhelm them from getting involved, but let them know that there are resources to support you. Moms Demand Action, that was one of the things that really made me want to get involved, because they're highly resourced, they're highly organized, they're highly passionate. And I said, you know what, this is something I feel like I can get involved with and make an impact, because I'm finding organizations that are well organized I do better in. Sometimes efforts are ground floor and there's opportunities to get involved and give them some feedback. I think there's some things I learn in Moms Demand Action that inform other organizations that I'm in. So to your point of what you said before about these things crossing over and, not just having like my mom face or my volunteer activist face, I think everywhere I show up, I'm always optimizing and doing it in a way that's not a know-it-all way, which I have such a hard time not being a know-it-all. Like, I'm the eldest child. I am a Virgo. My mother's a Virgo, so she's like put all that onto me. Like, I'm like double Virgo because of having been mothered by a Virgo. And I think there's this pressure of the overachiever that's inherent to some of the culture having gone to single sex institutions, where it's like being shaped into this little expert, like Quiana expert. And even my siblings and my parents like to joke about it. They used to call me like the law when I was like a kid. It was like, Quiana is the law. And yeah, it's serious. But I think I've learned over the years that people are more responsive and receptive and more likely to engage if you're able to meet them where they're at. Yeah. And that doesn't mean you let people walk over you. It doesn't mean you don't call them out on their crap, but it means that you're more likely to get engagement when you do it in an approachable way that welcomes them in, instead of being combative and abrasive.
So with that in mind, as you're thinking about, you're doing community outreach, how, if people are listening to this right now, and if you're in Boston or Massachusetts or otherwise, I mean, there are chapters of Moms Demand all over the country. What have you found to be really fruitful opportunities for people to be met where they are, especially if they're new to this space of kind of, they don't see themselves as that activist where, yeah, sure, I've already been doing this, add another to my plate. It's, I'm new to this, but I want to do something. How have you seen, what kind of avenues have you seen to be successful, or do you seem that you feel you employ when you're interacting with people that are relatively new to this space or unsure how to enter the Moms Demand family?
Yeah, and I think this goes back to even knowing your own personality type, right? So if you know, like, hey, I'm not going to be up on a stage speaking to hundreds of people, I think Moms Demand Action in particular has ways that you can show up by even writing postcards. That was something that we were doing last night at our monthly Moms Demand Action meeting here in Boston. So what that gives you the opportunity to do is to have a script that you handwrite to your local representatives that allows you to engage in a way that maybe you're better at writing. Maybe you're better at showing up at something like Advocacy Day, which we did this week at the State House, where we go in small groups and we talk to a handful of representatives throughout the State House. That way you're there in community and you don't have to necessarily be the one to speak up, but when you hold space, that's really powerful. So when your legislator sees you come into their office and you're with 10 to 20 other red shirts, as we wear for Moms Demand Action, you show up as a force. It's not intimidating, but it definitely makes you memorable. And so I think what Moms Demand Action has done really well was find these different ways that people can engage, or if they're a public speaker, if they have the daytime ability and they're scheduled to come to the State House. Let's say you only want to be able to text messages to people. They have a system called Hustle, which is technology used for other activism apps that allows you to mass text groups of people with script responses, but still have a natural conversation with them. And it allows you to, even in your downtime, when you're sitting at, let's say, your kid's swim practice, like I found myself doing, and I said, wow, there's 100 people here on this list that I need to engage and remind them to come to the next meeting or to take action. And these are people that a lot of times have opted in, so it's not like a robocall.
Right.
It gives you the opportunity to interact in that way. So I really like that Moms Demand Action allows you to show up where you're able. They do things like tabling. For example, this Saturday, there's an opportunity at one of the local colleges for volunteers to come and literally sit at an information table and share with passersby. Even at farmers markets, we do a lot of that. So you're not alone. Typically, you're there with an experienced volunteer, and then little by slowly, here I am now 2 years later. Oh, I can handle tabling. I remember the first time I went. It was intimidating, but now I know the language, I know the topics, I know the legislation. It becomes like building a muscle, right? And you're not gonna get strong until you start.
Right. And then you get a viral tweet out there in the world, and you then learn how to navigate that in the best way possible, that you feel comfortable and you can elevate the message, but also hopefully bring more people in to the community and conversation in the way that they feel most comfortable. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. It's so funny, the law, that's what you were, right?
The law.
The law. Yes, that's your superhero name. It's so funny when you were talking about expertise and being the expert and struggling with this need to feel like you're an expert. When you're writing a bio, I'm sure you've had to write a bio or two when you're doing, submissions for things, or even just bios to show up at different conferences. And there is this want and desire to be called an expert. And I've always had such a hard time with that, only in the sense that the exposure to the word expert has always felt kind of fixed. So once you become an expert in something, you know it already, and you're moved on to the next. So you get the black belt in karate, and then where else are you going to go, right? And I'd love to hear a little bit from you of like how that word, I don't know if that word does the same for you. I find myself being like, yeah, I've learned I have expertise in this, but I'm always going to be a student. This is a very kind of cyclical thing where, yeah, cool, I get a certain level of understanding, but then I get to a point where I'm like, oh, there's so much more I don't know. There's another level or layer.
I think there's a gender disparity in this labeling of expert. And I actually was talking to an elder, another woman, who said to me, Quiana, you're qualified. I was at a point that I was getting all these opportunities earlier this year, and I'm like, what did I do differently? Like, what's happening? It literally felt like floodgates were opening, and I was like, is there some type of moon phase happening that I don't know about? Because I kept hearing people talking about the moon and all these things. I said, well, what's happening with the moon phase? Like, that wasn't part of my vocabulary growing up.
Yeah.
But this elder, she said, Quiana, you have to realize you've been doing this work for so long, and you're learning as you go along, but the more you get established, the more you speak with authority, the more people seek you out, and the more opportunities find you. You're an expert. And I'm like, oh, okay.
Okay, cool.
I was like, yeah, but I think that speaks to the disparity. Like I said, I feel like gender, I feel like men with half the ability are walking around saying I'm an expert or I know this, but women a lot of times second guess themselves, like, am I really an expert? And I think I felt this need of being able to talk to other women as they kind of figure out, like, what do I want to be when I grow up? Because I still feel like there's these opportunities for like life 2.0 once you get through some of these other milestones, not necessarily having to be married or partnered or having children, but even just as time goes by and you start to think about what's next, right? And people aren't staying with their companies until they get a pension like the olden days. I think people are transforming themselves, and a lot of times it takes an objective viewpoint to say, hey, you're actually good at this, or yes, you are an expert. So I think it goes back to the importance of building community. I think not everything happens online. I think it's good to get out in person and talk to people and go to these events as your schedule sees fit, as your budget sees fit. I do recognize that there's a privilege in even being able to have the type of job, if you want to call it a job, or have these roles that I play. I have a very supportive partner who understands and champions what I do, and I think that's crucial. If that's not for you in a partner relationship, I think it's really important to seek out whatever friend, cheerleader, mentor. I think you need that to be the best version of yourself that you can be. So all that plays into me being able to be comfortable saying, well, I'm an expert uh, in the social media marketing space as an entrepreneur. I'm an expert mother for that. You know, I don't always have it together, but
Right.
you know what? I said, okay, these kids are 5 and 9, and they're still alive.
And they're good humans. What about that? Hey,
That's a
yeah.
good track record.
Yes. Well, and I think there's a part of it to think of expertise as not an endpoint, right? But as
Mhm.
a starting point for that 2.0 or 3.0 or whatever it is, that it isn't
Mhm.
necessarily the top of the mountain, but it might be a
Mhm.
part of the mountain that you're getting to keep climbing or to decide where you're going next with that information and that knowledge that you have.
That's why Michelle Obama's becoming was so powerful. I mean, just her language and being able to go hear her speak when she came to Boston, it was very emotional because it
Mhm.
was like, oh my gosh, that can be me, right? That, I mean, so her boots were like stunning that she wore, those glitter boots, but
Yes.
whatever. Um,
You're like, that could be me. I could do
yeah,
that.
it's like fashion goals, life goals, relationship goals. She was just such the embodiment of of a role model. And I think hearing her even say, I'm evolving, it allowed so many women anecdotally, that I've interacted with since hearing her speak, who have also heard her or read her book, to be able to give themselves some grace, right? And some leeway to say, okay, I can still say that I'm figuring this out, but let's give ourselves the accolades and let's take some time not to get down on ourselves. Let's not get down on ourselves for where we may be lacking, but let's celebrate how far we've come.
Yes. I just did a huge breath and shoulders down in that, right? Because I think we do
Yeah.
operate on this like shoulders up, go, 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 especially in the Northeast. We're in this place of like go, go, go. It's getting colder, so we all have our many layers on and we're hustling to get as quickly as possible, right? And this idea that like it really is important in order for you to, you even mentioned the Hustle app. There we go, hustle all over the place. But like this importance of slowing down and accepting and embracing and celebrating the work we've put out there, whether that has resulted in some point of like accepted celebration of like a certificate, or you've achieved, you have one X, Y, and Z thing, or you are now, a lot of people by having the resume of life, right? So I am married and I have kids. Those are the endpoints, but really there's so many things along that journey that are worth taking a minute and just that was
Right.
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, mind, body, soul, for getting me
Yes.
to this point. It's so important. Okay. So
Yes.
the last thing I like to ask people about is, what is, I think I might know an answer on this, but what is, if you could kind of press, I like to say easy button or like magic wand, you could do something that would change the course of an issue, a topic, a struggle that's going on in the world right now. What easy button issue, if you could make an easy button issue out of something that is not, because most things aren't, what would that be, and what would the impact of that easy button press look like?
Wow. I think right now what I see the origin of so many issues plaguing us across the board, and I'm just going to talk as my experience as a Black American woman, is the issue of racism. And I think because that original sin of the United States has never been addressed, has never been reconciled in the way that we see other first world countries having done so when they have troubled histories, when we look back at how this nation was founded, where we find ourselves at now is not surprising. Now, to some of us, it may be, but I think there's a whole cohort of people who know American history and world history who are able to look at it and say, "Oh, of course, this is a equation, and now we're at the equal sign,
Mm-hmm.
and we know what's coming." I think there's this notion of, you know, surprise. Oh, this isn't the America I knew or grew up with. but I think all these things have been under the hood and now they're being uncovered. So I think if I could press the easy button, it would be for that reconciliation to happen and not to feel like we have to wait for them to do it, but start with where we're at right now in our own communities, because a lot of the things that trouble or plague us or worry us or keep us up at night aren't necessarily what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's what's happening in these local community environments. So whether it be getting involved civically, getting your elected officials, changing them out, voting with your dollars. I think there's all these things on a micro level that we can do, but I also think it's that initial reconciliation of let's get rid of these barriers that have been in place for 400, 500 years in this country. And I think if we reconcile that, everything else from socioeconomic disadvantage to all of these walls that are up, the hatred, the vitriol, we'll see that be broken down. So more involvement, more engagement, less apathy. I think next year when we get into, of course, it being an election year, regardless, when we look at the fact that 40% of the eligible Americans who are able to vote opt out of the whole thing completely, I think that speaks to the overall sentiment that a lot of people are carrying, this apathy. And I think we have to care. We have to care more and have more conversations to engage people to show up. So thank you for having this platform that allows that to move forward.
Of course. I love that. I'm like, easy button, have everybody just be able to see the things that they haven't been able to see maybe. And sometimes it's scary, right? And we were talking about therapy a lot, and a lot of this stuff, especially when it's 400 years old and generations old, that like it's super hard to pull those things away right away. So I just want to say thank you for your time today. I know how valuable, and I value your time so very much. And so I am just so grateful. And if anybody's listening wants to get to know more about Quiana, get to know about Mom's Demand, where can they find you? Where should they be looking for you?
Yes, I'm Harlem Lovebirds across social media. I'm most active on Instagram, so that's Harlem Lovebirds, all one word. I have a blog, Harlem Lovebirds, but usually on my Instagram stories is where the party happens, as you know, Nikki.
It's amazing. Follow her immediately. All right. Well, thank you. And I know you're off to pick up the little one, so thank you. Sending you so much love and energy.
Yes, thank you. And on another note, even if you edit this out, we might have to do some dates, local dates, because I still want to see the Hustle movie. We got to send up some we got to send up some juju for Alt Summit. And the other piece is I'm heading to the Cape this weekend. I posted on social media a little bit about wanting to do retreats and things of that nature out on the Cape. I'm leaving today, and I'm going to go hang out on the Cape and like have some restful retreat time. So one of these times I'll have to get you out to the Cape with me.
These are all tough sells. I'm like, I don't know. No, all about it. I can't wait.
Yeah.
Well, honestly, thank you so much for your time.
Yes.
Have a great day and have a wonderful trip.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Wasn't Quiana truly amazing? See, I don't oversell in the intros. She's a pretty incredible person. I feel like, don't you want to hang out with her? I mean, I do. So I really do encourage you to go follow Quiana on social media so you can hear and see all the incredible things that she's putting out in the world. Keep an eye out. We actually applied to appear together on a panel at this upcoming conference called the Alt Summit that's happening in March of 2020. Send good vibes out for us. We really hope we get selected. Hopefully the selection is coming today, the end of this week, beginning of November somehow, some way. If you're listening to this later, hopefully we've been selected and you can come join us in March. I am just so excited that you stuck with us and you're part of this wonderful conversation and community. And again, please do, if this helps you start a conversation or spark some sort of discourse or understanding, please do use this podcast episode to spark that conversation with somebody in your life. It's so important. And we want to hear from you how it goes, hear from you what you think about the episode, hear from you for topics that you want to hear about. So go to nikkyinnocent.com/podcast, click on the Join the Conversation link, and let us know what you've been thinking. All right, we'll catch you on the next episode.